Great. Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to present. So I'm going to try to complement some of the earlier talks that we heard today, and especially also in this session, by taking sort of a cross-country perspective and talking about aging across OECD countries. So a lot of the graphs that I'm going to show, we've seen variants of those before, so I'm going to be quick on some and more slowly on others. So what I'm showing here is the increase in the projected increase in the old age dependency ratio between 2023 and 2050. And you can see that across all OECD countries, that dependency ratio is predicted to increase significantly, on average by around 20% or so. Now, a lot of that is driven by longevity gains, but a big part is also just driven by different cohort sizes reflecting sort of declines in fertility rate over the past 50 and 60 years. However, as we've also seen before, aging is not a phenomenon that's limited to the OECD. In fact, most other OECD countries, most other countries in the world are aging as well, as shown here for select countries in blue. Now, many speakers before me have mentioned that this is, of course, a big concern to policymakers, as those rising old age dependency ratios may imply mounting fiscal pressures due to expenditures on health and pensions. However, when thinking about the effect of population aging on GDP per capita growth, which is the topic of this talk here, they do not tell the entire story. So in fact, I think to think through the problem of understanding how aging affects GDP per capita growth, it's useful to start from a simple decomposition of GDP per capita into three underlying terms, each of which can potentially be affected by population aging. So the first term, obviously, is the working age population share. That is the ratio of the working age population to the total population. That is a purely demographic term and is directly affected by population aging. But then there's a second term, which is the aggregate employment rate, so the ratio of workers to the working age population. That also potentially is affected by population aging, as there is sort of a decline in participation rates in the ages leading up towards retirement age. And then finally, there's labor productivity. That is the GDP produced by, GDP divided by the number of workers. Now, that third term is arguably the most difficult one to predict how that evolves under population aging, and I will get back to that sort of later in my talk. But let's first start with the first two terms, the working age population share and the employment rate. The first thing to note is that the working age population share does not depend only on the old age dependency ratio. In fact, the working age population share is inversely related to the sum of the youth dependency ratio and the old age dependency ratio. And if we look at how these two dependency ratios have evolved over time in the OECD as a whole, what we can see here is that actually the overall dependency ratio has decreased throughout much of the second half of the 20th century and into the first decade of the 21st century. And that is because, despite gradual increases in the old age dependency ratio, the youth dependency ratio has actually declined. Now, going forward, of course, the overall dependency ratio is going to increase because the old age dependency ratio is continuing to rise while the youth dependency ratio has stabilized. So that's all about, sort of dependency ratios that are defined by fixed cutoffs at somewhat arbitrary levels, like age 20 or age 65. And we've heard from many speakers before that those age cutoffs are indeed arbitrary. In fact, if we look at data on, for example, labor force participation rates, as I'm plotting here in the left panel for the OECD, separately for men and women, we see that it's neither the case that everybody below 65 is in the labor force, nor is it the case that everybody above 65 is outside the labor force. We do see that labor force participation rates start declining well before sort of official retirement ages, and they don't reach zero until very old ages. Another disadvantage of looking purely at old age dependency ratios is that we miss on a lot of interesting demographic trends within the working age population. So here I'm plotting again the OECD-wide population age distribution at two different points in time, 2023 and 2050. And what you can see is that not only will we see a growing share of people above 65, we will also see an aging of the working age population. And these two phenomena together could, of course, imply some effects on GDP per capita. In fact, to put some numbers on sort of how much these demographic trends here might affect GDP per capita, we conducted a simple simulation exercise in a paper that we published not too long ago, where we combine country-specific projections demographic projections with country-specific data on the age profile of participation rates to project sort of the declines in GDP per capita under the assumption of fixed age-specific employment rates and fixed aggregate productivity. And this is what you find. In fact, that's the graph that Alvaro has shown earlier. So we can see that for the OECD as a whole, those demographic trends would imply a decline in GDP per capita of around 7% between 2021 and 2050. However, that 7% number for the OECD as a whole hides a lot of cross-country heterogeneity. And for some countries, notably Spain, Korea, Italy, but also Greece, those numbers could be quite a bit larger, exceeding minus 15%. Okay, there is, however, at the same time, another phenomenon going on, which is sort of the flip side of that demographic coin of aging, which is that OECD populations are beginning to shrink. In fact, because of declining birth cohort sizes, the youth population of the OECD has been shrinking for several decades now, as depicted here by the dashed green line. But we're right now sort of at that point in time where we're entering a new phase in terms of the growth of the working age population as well, which is set to decrease going forward in the OECD as a whole. Again, just as with aging, population growth for the OECD as a whole hides a lot of variation across OECD countries. Here, I'm showing the percentage change in the working age population between 2020 and 2050 for each OECD country and a few select non-OECD countries. And you can see that there are some countries that will see very, very strong declines in the size of their working age population, while other countries are projected to see further increases over the next couple of decades. Of course, you know, growing or shrinking working age populations are important for a number of reasons. Most directly, they affect GDP, because GDP growth is just the sum of GDP per capita growth and population growth. But they may also affect productivity to the extent that that slowing population growth has an effect on business dynamism or innovation and so on. And I'm also going to get back to that a bit later. All right, so this was just sort of to set the scene and to put some numbers on the potential effect that population aging could have on GDP per capita. But of course, it was derived under very strong assumptions, which is that age-specific participation rates remained constant. And we all know, and there's a lot of talks earlier that spoke about the possibility of lengthening working lives, but also other forms of increased labor force participation. And here, what I want to do in the next couple of slides is try to understand how much of an effect on GDP per capita these potential gains could have, and how much they would mitigate the pure compositional costs of aging. So of course, the motivation for that is that we are increasingly living longer and healthier. Here's a variant of a slide that we've seen before. This is not the gains in life expectancy at birth, but the gains in life expectancy at age 60 that we all sort of experienced between, you know, that all OECD countries experienced between 2000 and 2019. You can see that those gains are really quite substantial. So all OECD countries have seen meaningful increase in life expectancy at age 60. What is perhaps even more important is that a lot of those additional years are actually spent in good health. And at the same time, we've seen a sort of reversal in trends towards early retirement, with a lot of increased labor force participation rates of older individuals since the year 2000 or so. If you focus, for example, on the dotted line for men aged 60 to 64, this age group has seen a very strong increase in labor force participation rates over those past 20 or 30 years. Now, of course, an important question is what drives those gains in participation rates? Research conducted by colleagues of mine at the OECD a few years ago sort of look at those gains in participation rates and decomposed them into various potential drivers. And the interesting finding of that paper is that they argue that a lot of those gains are actually not due to changes in sort of the statutory age of retirement, but due to gains in life expectancy and education, among other things. And that's, of course, a very interesting result and a very hopeful result, because it means that under further gains of life expectancy, which we are projecting, you could see also lengthening of working lives. So we also wanted to put some numbers on sort of that channel, trying to understand how much of the original cost of aging that I've shown you on an earlier graph can be undone by this channel. And this is what we do here. And so what we do specifically is we first plot with the red dots here the costs of population aging obtained under the assumption of fixed age-specific employment rates. And then with the blue triangles, we predict the cost from aging under longevity-adjusted participation rates. And we compute those longevity-adjusted participation rates by making the following assumption. We say that for each person age 50 above, we first look at demographic projections and try to understand how much gains in healthy life expectancies these age groups stand to experience. And then we say, what if the participation rates are actually not a function of how many years you have lived so far, but of how many healthy years you have ahead of you. So for example, in 2050, if there's an age group that has 20 years of healthy life ahead of them, then we'll assume that their participation rate is the same as the age group today that has 20 years of healthy life ahead of them. Doing that, you can see that the participation rates of older individuals would increase substantially, and the cost of aging would be therefore lowered. However, in most countries, there's still a drag from population aging. Before I move on to sort of the second part of the presentation where I look at productivity, I want to stick with participation rates for just one more slide, but now shift the focus away from older individuals and towards younger individuals, because we talk a lot about lengthening working lives, but we also shouldn't forget that in most OECD countries, there's a lot of scope for increasing participation rates of younger age groups as well. So in this exercise here, what we do is we look at current age-specific participation rates in OECD countries, and we define what we call an employment frontier. So the employment frontier is computed by looking at each age and for each gender separately, which are the 5 top performing OECD countries in terms of participation rates, and then piecing them together to define sort of a employment frontier as it exists today in the OECD. And then we ask the question, by how much would GDP per capita grow if a given country could reach that frontier by 2050? Now note that because we constructed the employment frontier based on observed participation rates today, it's not such a strong assumption to assume that a country might be able to achieve that frontier, to reach that frontier, over the next 2 or 3 decades. Doing so, what you find is that a lot of countries could see very, very large gains in GDP per capita simply by closing that frontier in the age group 25 to 60. So ignoring all of the sort of gains that you also get from lengthening working lives, which I've shown on the previous slide. This is particularly true for countries in Latin America and Southern Europe, where especially female participation rates tend to be relatively low in an international context. Okay, so now let me move to population aging and productivity, which is the third part of that sort of decomposition of GDP per capita that I showed initially. And here I want to start sort of by acknowledging that the general notion seems to be that clearly population aging is bad for productivity. Now we've done a sort of a literature review that we published about a year ago, and from that literature we get a bit of a more nuanced perspective. So I think the reason that many people believe that population aging is clearly bad for productivity is because they have some sort of graph like this in mind, where individual productivity increases initially with experience and then declines at some point with poor health or obsolescence of skills. And if that's the case, then perhaps there's purely compositional effects as the average worker grows older. However, if you look at the literature, there's actually very limited evidence for a strong productivity decline leading up to retirement. And that is especially true for sort of white-collar jobs. But even outside white-collar jobs, the evidence for productivity declines is just not that strong. Moreover, even if you were to assume that productivity peaked mid-career and then sort of declined in the ages leading up to retirement, it's not clear that the purely compositional effects would be large, because of course as the workforce ages, you have more older worker, but you also have fewer younger workers, and younger workers, due to sort of the limited time that they had a chance to accumulate experience and so on, are also not the most productive workers. So maybe in the end, it's sort of a wash. Having said that, of course, those purely compositional effects are not the only way, or not the only mechanism through which population aging could affect productivity. The literature has also highlighted the possibility that workforce aging could slow the career progression of younger workers, because basically a lot of the sort of more senior jobs are occupied by older workers, limiting thereby the ability of younger workers to accumulate experience, which is then important for successful entrepreneurship. Alternatively, a rising share of older households could increase consumer inertia, which then would in turn perhaps generate market power for incumbents and discourage firm entry, and thereby affect productivity. Another argument is that slowing population growth, so not just population aging, but slowing population growth, could depress business dynamism, because firm entry, as it's argued, is an equilibrium linked to the pace of labor supply growth, and as that slows, perhaps business dynamism and business startup rates slow as well. And then, finally, the most important channel in the long term is, of course, innovation. And you may think that population aging or population shrinkage could slow innovation and technological progress. On the other hand, population aging and population shrinkage could also lead to capital deepening and adoption of labor-saving technologies, which sort of would work in the other directions. We've tried to summarize that large literature in a simple table here. I'm not going to have the time to go through all of these different channels, but I just want to flag here that sort of we think through the different mechanisms for which population aging could affect productivity, organizing them from more micro-level mechanisms like the sort of direct effect of age differences in individual productivity towards more macro channels, going through things like the structure of aggregate demand and capital deepening and so on. And we also look at the different demographic drivers, distinguishing between workforce aging, workforce shrinkage, and rising old age dependency ratios. And overall, the color coding here indicates whether we think the literature is providing a clear positive, a clear negative, evidence for a clear positive, a clear negative, or sort of a mixed link. And what you can see is that it's not all green, it's not all red, it's sort of a mixture. Of course, this is just a literature. We can look at history to try to understand how aging in the past has affected productivity. There are some studies with econometric strategies that allow them to sort of get at causal estimates that do find a negative effect of aging on productivity. Although those studies, the best ones, they measure productivity at the subnational level. For example, comparing state-level aging and state-level GDP, which of course is a setting in which some of the more macro channels are not operative. For example, channels running through capital deepening. If we just plot the raw correlation, I want to stress here, this is just the raw correlation of aging in the past. I have here in the left channel one measure of aging, which is the change in the old age dependency ratio, and the right panel an alternative measure of aging, which is the average age of the working age population. If we correlate that with changes in the GDP per hour worked, sort of our preferred measure of productivity, we find very little correlation, at least in the past, for OECD countries. Okay, so let me now use the final minutes that I have to talk a bit about policies to mitigate aging-related headwinds. When we sort of thought about how to think about policies, we found it useful to sort of distinguish between what we call mitigation policies and adaptation policies. So mitigation policies would be any policies aimed at preventing or slowing population aging itself. And then adaptation policies would be policies that are aimed at creating conditions for older societies to thrive in. Let's first think about mitigation. And when we think about mitigation in the context of demographic change, two things usually are mentioned. One is mitigation through increased birth rates, and the other would be mitigation through migration. But let's start with mitigation through increased birth rates. So mitigation for increased birth rates is actually not so obvious. because population aging today largely reflects past declines in fertility, and by definition, these can't be undone. Moreover, if we were somehow to be able to increase birth rates today, those would not prevent population aging over the next 2 or 3 decades or so. So that leaves the question of mitigation through migration. And here too, we sort of try to put some numbers onto this question with a simple simulation exercise. So the first sort of thing to acknowledge is that, of course, migrants indeed tend to be young at arrival. So here we are plotting the age distribution of migrants arriving, of immigrants in EU EFTA countries between 2013 and 2021. And you can see that most migrants are in their early 20s, and then few migrants are at very old ages. However, immigrants themselves also age. This is their age at arrival. Of course, immigrants themselves also age. And very importantly, some migration is between OECD countries. So if we try to understand the evolution of the old age dependency ratio for the OECD as a whole, for example, these migration flows, they just net out. So an interesting question that you might ask is, well, what level of migration would prevent an increase in the old age dependency ratio for the OECD as a whole? And we conduct this simple simulation exercise by making the following assumptions. So we assume that the immigrant age distribution at arrival is exactly that we've observed in the past and what I've shown you just now. And we also assume that immigrants experience the same age-specific fertility and mortality rates as the non-immigrant population. Of course, this is a conservative assumption. You may want to assume that immigrants have a slightly higher fertility rate. Quantitatively, it doesn't change the picture very much, but this is sort of a conservative assumption here. And what I'm plotting here in the solid black line is the net migration rate expressed as a percentage of the population that would be required to stabilize the old age dependency ratio in the OECD at current levels going forward. And in the red dotted line, I'm showing the average net migration rate that the OECD as a whole did experience between 2000 and 2020. And what you can see is that the level of immigration required to stop population aging is an order of magnitude higher than what we've seen in the past. Now, lower migration levels would be sufficient to prevent a decline in the working age population, but that's sort of a different question. Now, I want to stress here, of course, that even though migrants perhaps cannot fully stop population aging in the OECD, of course, migration still is a very important factor, and migrants can still play an important role in fostering business dynamism and affecting the demographic profile of individual countries. And for that last point, also, of course, within OECD migration is quite relevant. Okay, so if preventing population aging is not possible, that is to say, if mitigation is difficult, then the focus should move towards adaptation. And here we think that adaptation is both important and promising. We have an entire session tomorrow dedicated to the question of how to best design institutions for the longevity society. But let me just say here that government policies can help create an environment for other societies to thrive by promoting healthy aging, promoting lifelong learning, harnessing the benefits of age-diverse teams, supporting business dynamism, and importantly, mobilizing existing labor resources, not just at old ages, but in all age groups. And I think I managed to leave a couple of minutes for questions.
You definitely have. Thanks a lot. Are there any questions from the floor? If not, I might ask a question, taking the privilege of the chair. Wanted to just follow up on some stuff you said on the productivity effect, the potential productivity effects of aging, right? And about your thinking of, how much of that, because you were talking about labor productivity, right? So I was thinking how much of that you think is through, or the literature says is through TFP changes, and how much of that would be more through capital deepening and investment, if you have any thoughts on that?
So I think the literature, the empirical literature on population aging and growth, I think can be partly divided into those papers that look at population aging and GDP per capita, and those that look at population aging and productivity, either measure of productivity. I think there's a real question of whether or not, I'm sorry, on TFP, yes. So I think that the papers that find a strong effect of population aging on growth, that effect is mostly operated through labor supply rather than through sort of productivity. I'm not sure.
Okay, more questions?
You mentioned you focused on labor supply and the obstacles labor supply. You didn't mention labor demand on behalf of employers. And I'm just wondering, was that because your focus was labor supply or because you don't think the issues there are as important?
No, so I think labor demand is very important. I mean, you know, what we do here is our simulation exercises basically show how much GDP per capita could grow if certain participation rates were to change. Of course, those need to change in equilibrium. You know, you need to, like, supply chains, but also there needs to be demand for hiring those workers. There is a literature on sort of age discrimination, and we do emphasize in our paper that working against age discrimination, working towards harnessing the benefits of age-diverse teams is incredibly important. And we also heard from earlier speakers about the importance of age-friendly jobs, which Andrew stresses, which may very well be a limiting factor for a lot of older individuals staying in the labor force.
Andrew, I think.
Thank you, and lovely, comprehensive and nuanced survey of all the macro. I'm just curious, I guess I'll ask the same question to IMF. What's the response been across various governments to this type of work? And are there any areas that consistently you get traction with, or does it tend to vary across countries?
So I think when we presented this work at our committee meeting, I think the most interesting reaction was that people were surprised about the lack of strong evidence for a productivity effect of aging. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, first of all, people think about the fiscal implications of aging, which are very obvious, and I think there's no discussion around that. And then people think about the growth implications of aging, which to a first order operate through labor supply, which again, I think the literature has evidence to show for. But if we think about the relationship between aging and productivity, it's just much less clear. And there was a lot of interest in that finding.
Well, thanks a lot. I was also quite struck by your, which I agree with actually, your point on mitigation where, I mean, fixing it with fertility rates will actually make the problem worse for the next 20 years, because the ratio of working age population to total population will actually be lower for a period of time. Anyway, we should move to the next speaker, and thank you very much, Matthias.